She had been counting seconds since the sentence landed, which was something she had learned to do a long time ago in rooms like this one, rooms where something had just happened that everyone in them had decided, by collective and silent agreement, to pretend had not. 7 seconds. The conversation around her had resumed the way conversations resumed after a thing like that, louder than before, more deliberate, the particular social volume of people who were compensating for having heard something they were not going to acknowledge having heard. She was holding a glass of white wine that she had not drunk and was not going to drink, and that existed in her hand primarily as an object to hold, so that her hands had somewhere to be. The room was the main sitting room of the Voss family house, which was not a house in any sense she had grown up understanding the word. It was a building of the kind that had a name, with ceilings high enough that the light from the chandelier did not reach the corners and furniture that had been chosen to last, rather than to invite. She had been in this room twice before in 2 years, and both times on work, business, and both times she had understood exactly what she was in it as, which was someone who worked for Nico Voss, and was therefore present in the capacity of that work, and not in any other capacity. She had understood that clearly, both times. She had understood it clearly tonight until approximately 8 minutes ago, when Marcus Voss had looked at her across the room with the expression of a man who had decided something and had said, in the voice of someone explaining a thing that should not need explaining, that she was not wife material. He had not said it to her specifically. He had said it to the room, to the 3 men standing nearest to him, to the woman to his left who was married to one of them, in the conversational register of someone making an observation about the weather or the quality of the wine. It had landed in the room the way things landed, when they were said at exactly the right volume to be heard, by everyone, and attributed to no one. 8 seconds. 9. She was doing the calculation she had done in rooms like this since she was approximately 14 years old, which was the calculation of how many seconds needed to pass before she could move toward the door, without the movement being legible as retreat. The answer varied by room and by situation, but the formula was constant, long enough that the exit looked like a natural transition, short enough that she was not still standing here after the number had reset, and she had to start counting again. She had gotten very good at this calculation over the years. She had gotten so good at it that most people would not have known she was making it, would have seen only a composed woman in a navy dress, holding a glass of wine and looking at something in the middle distance, with the expression of someone who was thinking about something else entirely. The expression was not performed. It was something she had developed so thoroughly over so many years that it had become the actual texture of how she held her face when she was doing the calculation. The composure and the arithmetic had merged into a single operation, and she could not have separated them anymore if she had tried. 14 seconds. She was going to aim for 30 and then move toward the window, which was not the door but was closer to the door than where she was standing, and from the window she could drift toward the hallway, and from the hallway she could find a reason to step outside that did not read as running. She had not looked at the door since the sentence. She had been specifically careful not to look at the door, because looking at the door was the thing that made the calculation visible, and she was not going to make the calculation visible in this room in front of these people, because she had been not making it visible for 29 years, and she was not going to stop in the house of the man she worked for. She was also not going to look at Marcus Voss, who had said the sentence and had then turned back to his conversation with the 3 men the way a person turned back to a conversation after contributing a point that did not require further elaboration. She was especially not going to look at the door to the adjoining room, which was the door she was aware of in the peripheral way she was aware of all things in rooms where she was doing the calculation. That awareness being part of the formula, the mapping of exits and adjacencies being the first step before the timing could begin. She was not going to look at it. She looked at the middle distance. She counted. 17, 18. The door opened. She knew it was him before she looked because the room changed when he entered it. Not loudly, not in the way of rooms that went quiet when a dangerous man walked in, but in the specific way of a room that recalibrated itself around a center of gravity. Conversations did not stop. People did not turn. What happened was subtler than that. a collective slight adjustment, the way a mobile adjusted when you added weight to one element, everything moving just barely to account for the new balance. She had been observing this happen for 2 years in offices and meeting rooms and once in a parking garage, and she had catalogued it as information about him without ever deciding what to do with the catalogue. She looked at him. He had come from the study where he had been with 2 men she did not know the names of, and he was still in the posture of that conversation, slightly forward, attention not yet fully redistributed. And then his eyes found the room and found her in it, and she saw the redistribution happen. She watched him read the room the way she imagined he read all rooms, not sequentially but all at once, taking in the configuration of people and the volume of conversation and the specific quality of the silence that existed in the places between the conversations, and she watched him arrive at a conclusion about what the room contained that she was fairly certain was accurate. He did not look at Marcus immediately. He looked at her. He looked at her for long enough that she became aware of it as a duration rather than a glance, long enough that 2 of the people nearest to her became aware of it and adjusted their positions by small degrees in the way of people who were making more space for something they were not sure about yet. She looked back at him. She was very good at not letting her face do things she had not decided it should do, and she held his gaze with the same composure she held everything with, the composure that had merged with the arithmetic and was no longer separable from it, and she did not look at the window or the door or Marcus Voss. She looked at Nico. He looked at her. The room breathed around them. Then he moved. He did not cross the room toward her. He crossed the room toward Marcus, which was a different direction, and she watched him do it, and watched Marcus see him coming and watched the expression on Marcus's face shift through several versions of itself in the space of approximately 2 seconds before settling on the version Marcus had decided was appropriate, which was the expression of a man who was pleased to see his brother and had no particular reason not to be. Nico reached Marcus and the 2 men standing with him, and he put his hand on the shoulder of one of the men in greeting, which was natural, and then he looked at Marcus and said something she could not hear from where she was standing. Marcus's expression did one more thing. It was a small thing, barely visible, but she was very good at small, visible things, and she saw it. It was not the expression of a man being greeted by his brother. It was the expression of a man who had just been told something that arrived with weight, in a register he had not anticipated, in a voice too quiet for the room to hear, but not too quiet for Marcus to hear exactly what was being said and what was not being said inside it. The man whose shoulder Nico had touched said something, and Nico responded with the appropriate social words, and the conversation in that part of the room continued as conversations continued, but Marcus did not speak again for the remainder of the time she was in the room. She did not leave at 30 seconds. She stayed for another 20 minutes because leaving at 30 seconds after Nico had crossed the room was a different kind of legibility, and she was not prepared to be legible in that direction either. She drank some of the wine. She spoke to 2 people about things she would not remember later. She was aware of Nico in the peripheral way. She was aware of exits and adjacencies. That same formula applied to a different variable, and she noted that he did not look at her again for the 20 minutes she stayed, and she noted that this was also information, and she filed it in the catalogue with everything else. When she left, it was through the hallway and then the front door, and the driver was outside, and the drive back to the city was 40 minutes, and she spent them looking at the window of the car and not thinking about what Marcus had said because she was very experienced at not thinking about things she had decided not to think about, and not thinking about the 20 minutes in which Nico had not looked at her, and what that meant alongside the crossing of the room, and the thing said too quietly for anyone else to hear, because she was going to need more time and more information before she could file those 2 things in the same place or in different places or anywhere at all. She looked at the window. The city came toward her, out of the dark. She held the calculation the way she held everything, carefully, without letting it show, and she did not arrive at an answer before she got home, which was unusual, and she sat with the unusualness of that for a long time before she went to sleep. She was still at her desk at 8:45, which was not unusual, and he was still in his office, which was also not unusual, and the floor had the particular quality it had after 7, when the last of the staff had gone and the building settled into itself, and the two of them occupied it the way they had occupied it on late nights for 2 years, separately and without discussion, and with a shared understanding of the geometry of it that had never needed to be articulated. She was working on the briefing notes for the Thursday meeting, which did not need to be finished tonight, and which she was finishing tonight because finishing them tonight gave her something to do with her hands and her attention. That was not the thing she had decided not to think about in the car on the way home, and had then continued not thinking about through dinner and a shower and the 40 minutes she had spent lying on her back looking at the ceiling before she had gotten up again and come back to the office, which she was aware was not a normal response to a night that had contained nothing unusual, and which she was not going to examine. She highlighted a line in the briefing document and changed the font size and changed it back. She moved a paragraph and moved it back. She was aware that she was not editing the document so much as occupying the document, using it as a location to be in while she was not thinking about the thing she was not thinking about, and she was aware that this was transparent to anyone who might be watching, and she was aware that no one was watching because it was 8:45 and the floor was empty, except for her and the man in the office at the end of the hall whose light she could see from her desk as a thin line under the closed door. The light had been there when she arrived at 8:15, which meant he had come back after the family dinner, as she had, and she had noted this and not given it a particular interpretation because she was not in the business of interpreting the movements of her employer, and because the alternative was to give it a particular interpretation, and she was not going to do that tonight. She heard his office door open at 9. She did not look up from the document. His footsteps were quiet. The particular quiet of someone who moved through spaces without surplus noise, and she tracked them in the peripheral way she tracked everything. The exits and adjacencies formula applied again, his position relative to her desk resolving from sound into a presence at the edge of her field of vision. He set something on the corner of her desk. She looked up. It was a cup of tea, which was not coffee, which was what she usually made for herself on late nights, and for a moment she looked at it, and then looked at him, and he was already moving back toward his office, and he said, without turning, "The milk is in the wrong order. I know." He knew she made her tea with the milk last. He had been in the same office for 2 years while she made tea on late nights, and he had observed the order. She looked at the cup. She looked at the door of his office, which he had not closed behind him. She picked up the cup. She thought about the order of the milk for longer than was warranted by the information it contained, sitting at her desk with the tea and the briefing document open and the thin line of light under his door, and she thought about it because it was a small thing, and small things were easier to think about than large things, and because the small thing and the large thing were connected in a way she was not ready to connect them directly. In 2 years, he had not made her tea. He had not made her anything. The boundary between what he was and what she was in relation to him had been maintained with the kind of consistency that was not effortful because it was structural, built into the arrangement from the first day, and sustained by both of them without discussion because neither of them had done anything to disturb it. She had thought about this boundary sometimes, late at night in the specific way she thought about things she had filed under not applicable, which was not the same as not thinking about them. She had filed the boundary under not applicable and left it there for 2 years, and tonight someone had said a sentence in a room full of people, and he had crossed the room toward his brother and said something too quiet for her to hear, and then 20 minutes later had crossed a different room and left a cup of tea on the corner of her desk with the milk in the wrong order, and she was sitting here at 9:15 with the cup in her hand, and the two things were not applicable anymore, and she was not sure what category to file them under instead. She finished the briefing notes at 10. She saved the document and closed her laptop and put on her coat and picked up her bag and walked to his office door, which was still open because leaving without saying good night was not something she did, and she was not going to start tonight because of a cup of tea and a sentence and a crossing of a room. She was going to do what she always did, which was conduct herself with the consistency that had made her good at this job and had made the 2 years work as well as they had worked. She knocked on the open door. He was at his desk with a file open and his jacket off and his sleeves pushed to his elbows, the configuration he wore on late nights. And he looked up. "I am heading out," she said. "The Thursday notes are done and sent to your calendar." "Thank you," he said. He looked at her for a moment in the way he had been looking at her since he walked into his office at 9, which was slightly different from the way he had looked at her for the previous 2 years. And she could not have articulated the difference precisely except that it was there and she had noted it. "Claire," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name in 2 years. He used her last name as a matter of practice, as he used last names for everyone, and the first name arrived in the office the way it had arrived in the car, and through dinner and across the ceiling at her for the past several hours, with a weight she did not have an immediate place for. She waited. "The car is downstairs," he said. "I arranged it when you came back in. It is late." She looked at him. She thought about the tea. She thought about the car. She thought about the specific texture of a person who communicated in actions rather than in words, who put things on corners of desks and arranged cars downstairs and crossed rooms without explaining the crossing, and she thought about what it meant to work for a person like that for 2 years, and to have developed, over those 2 years, a fluency in the language of the actions that she had never permitted herself to call a language, because calling it a language would have required her to acknowledge that she had been learning it. "Thank you," she said. She said it the way she said most things to him, with the composure that had merged with the arithmetic, neutral and professional, and giving nothing away. He nodded. She went to the elevator. She did not look back at the open door of his office, not because she was not aware of it, but because she was very aware of it, and awareness was not the same as looking. The car was a different one from the usual, newer, and the driver did not speak, which was usual, and the city was the same city it was every night, and the drive was the same 40 minutes, and she sat in the back with her bag on her lap and thought about the cup of tea in the car, and the first name and the crossing of the room, and the things said too quietly for anyone to hear, and she thought about them not as separate items to be filed separately, but as a sequence, as things that had a relationship to each other that was not incidental, and she thought, this is new. She had been working for Nico Voss for 2 years, and she had been very careful and he had been very consistent, and they had maintained, between them, a professional arrangement that worked because both of them had made it work, had chosen every day to keep it exactly what it was and not to let it become something else, and she had been comfortable with that choice, had in fact been grateful for it, because the alternative was a kind of proximity that had consequences she was not equipped to manage while also doing the job well. And doing the job well had been the priority, the thing she had organized the 2 years around. She looked out the window at the city going past and she thought, this is new. She thought about it for the rest of the drive. She did not arrive at a conclusion. She went home and did not go to bed for a long time, and the thing she had been not thinking about all day was now the thing she was thinking about, which was progress of a kind. Even if it was not the restful kind, she got up twice in the night. The first time to drink water, the second time for no reason she could identify, which was information about the state she was in, since she did not typically wake without reason. She stood at the window of her apartment both times and looked at the city, which was the city she had lived in for 6 years, and which she knew the way you knew a place you had navigated alone, for long enough that the navigation became instinct. She had come here from a smaller city with a job offer and a suitcase, and the specific kind of confidence that came from having spent 23 years proving something to people who were not paying attention, and she had built the 6 years carefully, the jobs and the apartment and the small, consistent life she had constructed with the deliberateness of someone who knew that nothing maintained itself. She had been good at the building. She was still good at it. The Voss job was the best job she had built toward, the most demanding and the best compensated, and the one that had required the most of what she was actually capable of. And she had done it well, and she was going to continue doing it well, and whatever was new about tonight was going to have to fit inside that, or it was not going to fit at all. She stood at the window the second time for longer than the first, and she looked at the city, and she thought about a cup of tea with the milk in the wrong order, and she thought about 2 years, of a professional arrangement that had worked because both of them had made it work. She thought, the question is whether both of us are still making it work in the same direction. She did not answer the question. She went back to bed. She slept, finally, just before 5, and when the alarm went off at 6:45, she got up and made coffee and got dressed and went to the office the way she went every morning, with the composure that had become indistinguishable from her actual texture, carrying the question with her the way she carried most things she had not yet answered, close and quiet, and not yet visible to anyone who was not specifically looking. The call came on a Wednesday, 3 days after the dinner, at 2:17 in the afternoon, when she was between tasks and had her phone on the desk face up, which was the only reason she saw the name before it went to voicemail. Marcus Voss. Not the main office line, not the assistant routing system, not any of the channels through which communications from the Voss family were supposed to come. Her personal number, which was not listed anywhere publicly and which she had given to the office directory 2 years ago as a contact of last resort for genuine operational emergencies. She looked at the name for 2 rings, then she picked up. "Miss Ashton," Marcus said. He said her name the way he said most things, with the particular smoothness of a man who had been conducting difficult conversations for long enough that they no longer felt difficult from the inside. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all," she said. Her voice was the voice she used when the situation required that the voice do the work that the face could not do because the face was not visible, level and professional and giving away precisely nothing. "I will be brief," Marcus said. "I have a proposal I think you will find worth considering, and I would prefer to make it directly rather than through an intermediary." She waited. He was the kind of man who respected the use of silence as a response. She could tell that from one dinner and one phone call, and she was not going to waste words when waiting would give her more information. "There is a severance arrangement available to you," he said. 6 months at your current rate. A reference letter I will write personally, and a placement with one of 3 firms I can recommend that would represent a step up from your current position in terms of compensation and profile. The arrangement requires only that you submit your resignation before the end of the month. She listened to all of this. She listened the way she listened to things that were designed to sound like offers, which was with the part of her attention that was translating what was being said into what was being communicated, because those 2 things were rarely identical. What was being said was, "Here is money and a better job." What was being communicated was, "You are a problem that someone has decided is worth solving expensively," which meant the problem was considered significant enough to justify the expense, which meant the problem was not actually about her at all. "I appreciate you calling directly," she said. "I will need some time to consider it." "Of course," Marcus said. "I would ask that you not mention this conversation to my brother in the meantime. Given the nature of the arrangement, I think you will understand why discretion serves everyone's interests." She said she understood. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the desk and sat with it for a moment in the way she sat with things that required sitting with, letting the shape of it become clear. He had called her personal number. He had offered her a significant sum of money and a better job. He had asked her to keep it from Nico. She was being asked to take a payment in exchange for removing herself from a situation, and the payment was generous in proportion to how much the removal was needed, and the request for secrecy was the part that told her exactly who the payment was for. It was not for her. It was for whoever had decided that she needed to be removed, and that person was paying from a position of sufficient concern to make the offer expensive, and that concern was the most informative thing about the call, more informative than the money or the job or even the personal number that she had not given to Marcus Voss. She did not tell Nico. She had said she would not, and she kept her word as a matter of practice, regardless of context, and also because not telling him gave her more room to think than telling him would have done, since telling him would have required managing his response, and managing his response would have consumed the attention she needed for the thinking. She did not accept the offer either. She knew this the moment Marcus had finished speaking, in the same way she knew certain things before she had articulated them to herself, by the quality of the response in her body, before her mind had caught up with the processing. She was not going to accept it. The reason she was not going to accept it was something she examined that night and the night after, with the specific care she gave to reasons she was not sure she was permitted to have. And what she found when she examined it was not a single clean reason, but a layered one, the way most true reasons were layered, with practical things on the surface and other things underneath. The practical things were that she was good at this job, and she did not want to leave it, and the firms Marcus had mentioned were not places she wanted to work. Those things were all true. Underneath them was something else that she had been not looking at directly for 2 years, and that the tea and the car and the first name and now this phone call had made increasingly difficult to not look at directly, which was that she was not going to accept a sum of money to remove herself from proximity to Nico Voss, and the reason she was not going to do that had nothing to do with the job. She was on her way from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee at 9 on Thursday morning, which was her usual time and her usual number, when she rounded the corner of the corridor and found Nico there, not at his desk but in the corridor, which was unusual, and she had the brief impression of someone who had been standing there for longer than the corridor warranted before he heard her and turned. "Good morning," she said. She held out his cup. He took it and looked at her over the rim of it, and she looked back at him with the composure and the arithmetic merged, and gave nothing away. "You look like you did not sleep well," he said. It was the kind of observation he did not typically make. For 2 years he had not made observations about how she looked, had maintained the same professional register in every interaction that she had maintained, and the observation landed with the weight of something that had crossed a line it had not crossed before. "I slept fine," she said, which was partially true. She had slept, just not well or enough. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had first seen on him in the room 3 days ago, and had been seeing in various forms since, the expression of someone doing a calculation whose variables he was still identifying. "I have the Thursday briefing ready when you are," she said, which was the redirect she used when a conversation needed redirecting back to the work, and it was reliable because the work was always there, and the work was always what they had instead of whatever else there might have been to have. "Of course," he said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he went into his office. She went to her desk. She opened the Thursday briefing and began to review it for the 3rd time, because reviewing it for the 3rd time was something to do, and she sat with the question that had been sitting with her since Wednesday at 2:17, and that she had not answered yet, which was not, should she take the offer? She had answered that one. The question she had not answered was, what does it mean that I have answered it the way I have answered it? And what am I going to do with that answer? He asked her at 4 in the afternoon, when the Thursday meeting had finished and the last person had left the room and she was gathering the briefing materials from the table. He did it the way he did things, without preamble, without the social scaffolding that other people put around questions they were uncertain about. "Claire," he said, and she looked up because the first name was still new enough to require her full attention. He was standing at the end of the table with his hands in his pockets and his jacket still on, which meant he had somewhere else to be, and he looked at her with the calculation expression and said, "Are you all right?" She stacked the papers in her hands. She looked at him. She had been asked this question many times in her life by many people, and she had answered it correctly every time, which was to say she had answered it in the way that closed the question down rather than opening it up, because opening it up was not something she did in professional contexts, or in personal ones, or in any context with any person she could think of off the top of her head. She arranged the papers. She said, "I am fine. Is there something you needed for the Henderson file?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her the way he had looked at the room on Saturday night, all at once, and arriving at a conclusion. Then he said, "That is not what I asked." She looked at him. He looked at her. The briefing room was very quiet and the city was doing its usual thing outside the windows, and she was standing at the table with papers in her hands and he was standing at the other end of it, and the professional arrangement they had built and maintained for 2 years was present in the room with them. The way a piece of furniture was present, something you arranged yourself around without thinking about it until someone moved it. She said, "No, I am not, particularly. The words came out before she had decided to say them, which was unusual, and she heard them arrive in the space between them, and felt the particular exposure of having said a true thing in a room where the usual practice was the careful management of what was true. He did not move. He did not fill the silence immediately. He said, after a moment, I did not think so. She looked at the papers. She looked at him. She said, I should get these filed before 5. He said, of course. She went to the door. She stopped because something made her stop, some version of the same instinct that had kept her counting seconds in the sitting room on Saturday, the instinct that said, this moment has a shape, and you are inside it and moving through it too fast. She said, without turning, thank you. For Saturday. He did not say you are welcome. He said, I heard what he said. She nodded, though he could not see it, and she went through the door and down the corridor and to her desk, and she sat down, and the papers were in her hands, and the question she had been not answering for 3 days had just acquired a new dimension, which was that he had heard what Marcus said, and had said so, which was not the same as explaining why he had crossed the room, but which was adjacent to it in a way that she was going to be sitting with for the remainder of the day and possibly considerably longer. She found the documents on a Monday morning, 9 days after the dinner, while preparing the materials for a meeting that had been added to the calendar with 48 hours' notice and that had no name attached to it, only an entry that said, Strategic Review, and a list of attendees that included 3 names she did not recognize, and one she did. The third name on the list was the surname of a family she knew from context, from 2 years of calendar management and correspondence routing, and the specific geography of Nico's professional relationships, as one of the 4 families whose alliance with the Voss organization constituted the structural foundation of everything else. She knew the surname the way she knew most things in her job, not in detail but in outline, sufficient for the work she was asked to do with it and no further. She was pulling together the background materials for the meeting when she found the folder. It was in the shared drive under a path she would not normally have accessed, except that the meeting notes from a previous engagement with one of the other attendees were stored there, and when she opened the folder looking for the notes, she found something else. The folder was labeled with a date from 6 months ago, and inside it were 3 documents: a proposal, a timeline, and a correspondence log, and she read the first 2 paragraphs of the proposal before she understood what she was reading, and then she closed the folder and sat for a moment, and then she opened it again because she was a person who did not look away from things she had already seen. The proposal was for a marriage arrangement between Nico Voss and the eldest daughter of the family whose surname was on the meeting attendee list. The timeline showed 6 months of preliminary contact, 3 meetings she had not known about and had not scheduled, and a projected formal engagement announcement within the next 60 days. The correspondence log showed communications between Marcus Voss and the family's representative over the same 6 months, consistent in tone and increasingly specific in detail, the correspondence of people who had been moving toward a conclusion for long enough that the conclusion felt close. She read all of it. She read it the way she read things she was required to understand completely, regardless of whether she wanted to, carefully, and without skipping, and without allowing the part of her that was registering a response to interfere with the part that was processing the information. She finished reading and closed the folder, and closed the shared drive, and sat at her desk and looked at her computer screen. The briefing room meeting was at 2 in the afternoon. It was 9:43 in the morning. She had 4 hours and 17 minutes before she needed to be in that room with those names on the attendee list, and the knowledge of what the folder contained, and the question she had been carrying since Thursday of the previous week, which had just acquired a context that changed its shape entirely. She went into his office at 11:30, which was not their usual meeting time, and she closed the door behind her, which she did not usually do. He was at his desk, and he looked up, and whatever he saw in her face, or in the closing of the door, made him set down what he was holding. She crossed to the chair she always sat in and sat in it, and she said, I found the strategic review folder in the shared drive while preparing the 2 o'clock materials. She watched his face. He was very good at not letting his face do things, better than almost anyone she had encountered in 2 years of professional proximity, but she had spent 2 years learning his specific vocabulary of small things, and she saw the thing that crossed his expression when she said it, small and fast, and gone before anyone less practiced would have caught it. It was not surprise. It was something closer to the expression of a person who had known a conversation was coming and had been calculating its timing and had now received the answer. "I see," he said. The folder contained a proposal and a timeline and a correspondence log, she said. 6 months of communications between Marcus and a representative of the family attending this afternoon's meeting, a marriage arrangement. He looked at her steadily. He did not confirm or deny what she had said. He did not move to explain or contextualize or to do any of the things people did when they had been caught in possession of information they had not shared. He simply looked at her, and the looking was complete in the way his attention was always complete. And she met it the way she met everything, with the composure that was her actual texture. And she said, "I have one question." "Ask it," he said. "Saturday night," she said. "The sitting room. When Marcus said what he said, and you came in from the study and crossed the room." She paused. She had rehearsed this question during the 4 hours between 9:43 and now, and she had found that all the rehearsed versions of it were longer than necessary, and that the necessary version was short. Was it because you maintain a standard about how people who work for you are treated, regardless of who is doing the treating? She stopped. He waited, because he understood that she had not finished. Or was it something else? She said. The office was very quiet. Outside the windows, the city was doing its usual indifferent business, and inside the room there were 2 people who had maintained a professional arrangement for 2 years, with a consistency that had required, from both of them, a continuous and largely unacknowledged effort, and one of them had just asked the question that the effort had been organized around not asking. She held his gaze. She was very good at holding gazes. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him weigh something, watched the bridge calculation happen in his face the way she had learned to read it, and she sat with the waiting the way she sat with all waiting, without filling it, and she thought, the answer matters. She had not said that to herself so directly before, but she said it now, silently and clearly, because it was true, and because she was done organizing her understanding of things around what she was permitted to acknowledge was true. The answer matters. She waited. He was quiet for long enough that she began to understand, with the specific and unwelcome clarity of a person who was good at reading rooms, that he was not going to answer the question, not because he did not have an answer, but because having the answer and giving it to her were 2 different things, and the second one required something that was different from anything they had negotiated in 2 years of professional arrangement, and he was a man who did not do things that had not been negotiated, who operated within the boundaries of what had been established and did not move outside them without a reason he could state. She understood all of this. She understood it, and she looked at him and felt, moving underneath the composure and the arithmetic, something she recognized as the particular tiredness of a person who has been carrying a question for a long time and has just discovered that the carrying is going to continue indefinitely. And she thought, I cannot do this anymore. Not the job, not the work. She was going to do the work for as long as she was here. But this, the sitting with the question in the same room as the answer, and knowing the answer was not going to be given, this was the thing she could not do anymore. She stood up. She picked up the folder she had brought with her, the printed copies of the documents she had decided to bring because she was a person who documented things and she had not known what the conversation was going to require. She said, I will have the 2 o'clock materials ready by 1:45. The family's representative has dietary requirements I flagged with catering this morning. She turned toward the door. She had her hand on the handle when he said her name, not her last name, her first name, the way he had said it on Tuesday night when he had told her the car was downstairs, with the weight it carried now that it had crossed from the register of last names into the register of first ones. She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She waited, her hand on the door handle, because whatever came next was going to be one of 2 things, and she needed a moment to be ready for either of them. "It was not the standard," he said. She turned around. He was still at his desk, but he was not looking at the desk. He was looking at her, and his face had the expression she did not have a name for, and had been not naming for 2 weeks. The one that was not readable or unreadable, but something she was in the process of acquiring a name for through accumulation, the way you acquired the name for something you had been seeing for a long time and had only just permitted yourself to look at directly. "I maintain the standard," he said. "I maintained it on Saturday. Those 2 things are both true." He paused. It was also not only the standard. She stood at the door. She looked at him. She thought about 2 years of professional arrangement and a cup of tea with the milk in the wrong order and a car downstairs and her first name in a corridor and a folder in a shared drive with 6 months of someone else's planning in it. She thought about the question she had been carrying and the answer she had just received and the further question the answer produced, which was, what now? She let go of the door handle. She walked back to the chair and sat down. She set the folder on the edge of his desk. She said, "Tell me about the meeting this afternoon. Not what is in the folder. What you know that is not in the folder." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." And he told her. And she listened. And the 2 o'clock meeting happened later with all the materials prepared correctly and all the dietary requirements accommodated. And Marcus was there. And he looked at her across the table once, with the expression of a man whose variable had not been resolved the way he had planned, and she looked back at him with the composure that was her actual texture, giving away nothing, and she thought, not yet. She stayed at her desk until 7. He stayed in his office. The floor emptied the way it always emptied, by degrees, the last people leaving around 6:30, and the building settling into the quiet she had come to know well over 2 years of late nights, and she sat in it and typed up the notes from the 2 o'clock meeting and sent them to the relevant parties and filed the copies and did all the things she did after meetings, the procedural work that existed on the surface of the day and that she had always been grateful for because it gave her hands something to do while the rest of her processed what was underneath. What was underneath tonight was more than it had been on other nights. He had told her things this afternoon, after she had put down the folder and sat back down and asked him to tell her what was not in the documents, and what he had told her was this. Marcus had begun the arrangement without consulting him, had conducted 6 months of negotiation on the premise that Nico would recognize the strategic value of the alliance and would agree to the terms, and had not told Nico because Marcus had calculated that Nico would be more likely to agree if the arrangement was sufficiently advanced before he was informed of it. Nico had found out 4 weeks ago, from a source that was not Marcus, and had said nothing to Marcus because he was still deciding what to do with the information, which was to say he was still deciding how to end something that Marcus had invested 6 months in building without destroying something that could not be rebuilt. She had listened to all of this and had understood, from the listening, several things she had not known before. She had understood that the strategic review meeting that afternoon had been Marcus's attempt to formalize the arrangement in a context where it would be harder to dismantle by introducing the other family to the Voss operation at a level that implied commitment. She had understood that Nico had known this before the meeting and had allowed it to proceed. She had understood that the question of why he had allowed it to proceed was something he had not answered and that she had not asked, because by that point she had enough to carry for one afternoon, and she had the notes to type and the meeting to manage, and she was a person who did her work first and carried the rest afterward. She finished the notes at 6:58. She saved the document. She sat for a moment, and then she typed a message to him. Internal system, the way she sent all messages after hours, when the work continued past the time when walking to his door was natural. The message said, "The meeting notes are filed and sent. Let me know if you need anything else tonight," he replied in under a minute, which was faster than his usual response time on internal messages, and the message said, "I do not need anything else tonight." Then, after a pause that she could see in the timestamp, he sent a second message. It said, "Thank you." She read both messages. She sat with them for a moment. Then she put on her coat and picked up her bag and went to the elevator, and she thought, on the way down, about a man who expressed things in actions rather than words and who had just, in the space of one afternoon, expressed more in words than he had in 2 years. And she thought about the work that lay between where they were and whatever came next. And she thought, I can do this. She did not mean the job. She had always been able to do the job. She meant the other thing, the thing that had been not applicable for 2 years and was no longer not applicable, the thing she was going to have to learn how to do alongside the work, in the same space, with the same person, and she was going to have to learn it without a template, because she did not have a template for this, and she did not think he did either, and they were going to have to build it the way she had built everything in the 6 years she had been in this city, carefully and deliberately, and with the specific kind of confidence that came from having decided that it was worth building even before you knew exactly what it was going to become. The meeting was on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the dinner, and she knew about it because she had scheduled it, which was her job, and she knew what it was for because he had told her, which was new. He had told her the Tuesday before, in his office after the floor had emptied, sitting across the desk from each other in the configuration of their usual late working sessions, that was the same in form and different in texture from every late session that had come before it, different in the way of something that has been redefined without being renamed, that continues to look like itself while being something else. He had said, I am going to speak to Marcus on Thursday about the arrangement. He had said, I would like you to know this before it happens. She had looked at him and thought about 6 months of a folder in a shared drive, and a sentence in a room, and a cup of tea with the milk in the wrong order, and 2 weeks of a professional arrangement in the process of becoming something neither of them had named yet. And she had said, I appreciate you telling me. He had said, there are things I am going to say that will close down what Marcus has been building, and they are going to be said in front of the family he has been negotiating with, because Marcus chose a context that requires a public resolution. She had understood that. She had also understood, without him saying it, that the things he was going to say in that room were going to be said in a way that would make the closing down permanent, and that permanent in their world had a specific meaning that was different from the ordinary meaning of the word. She had said, do what you need to do. He had looked at her with the expression she had been accumulating a name for over the past 2 weeks and said, I intend to. She was not in the room when the meeting happened. The meeting was in the private dining room on the floor above, which was the room used for the kind of conversations that required a particular setting, and she had prepared the room and the materials and had arranged the catering and had then returned to her desk the way she always returned to her desk after preparing a room, which was to do the work that existed on her desk and not think about what was happening in the room above her. She did the work. She answered 2 calls and filed 3 documents and drafted a letter and sent it for review, and she was on the 2nd call when she heard the elevator, which was not unusual, except that it was 40 minutes earlier than she had expected, and she finished the call and looked toward the elevator, and it was Marcus. He walked off the elevator and across the floor, and he did not stop at her desk, and he did not look at her, which was different from the way he had looked at her at the 2 o'clock meeting the previous week, which had been the look of a man monitoring a variable. He walked past her to the stairwell door and went through it without breaking stride, and she watched him go and thought, it is done. The elevator opened again 7 minutes later, and Nico came off it, and he was in the posture of someone who had finished something, not the tension release of relief, but the particular stillness of a person who has executed a decision they had fully committed to and who is now in the afterward of it. He looked at her as he came across the floor, and he said, when he reached her desk, it is done. She looked at him. How is Marcus? She asked. Angry, he said. He will be angry for some time, and then he will be practical, because that is who he is. He paused. What he said to you at the dinner. I told him this afternoon, in front of the family he spent 6 months building a proposal for, that he was wrong. She looked at him steadily. Wrong how? She said. Not what did you say, how was he wrong? Because the how was the part that mattered. The how was the part she had been not asking for 2 weeks, and was asking now because the professional arrangement had shifted enough that she was permitted to ask it, and because she was done being careful about what she was permitted. He said, he was wrong about what the word means. She said, which word? He said, the one he used. She looked at him. She thought about a man who expressed things in actions rather than words, and who was, in this moment, using words with the specific economy of someone who had thought carefully about which ones were necessary and which ones were not. She thought about a folder in a shared drive and a timeline with 60 days on it, and an arrangement that had been built for 6 months without his knowledge, and that he had dismantled in a single Thursday afternoon, in a room above her head. She said, "What did you say? In that room?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I said that the kind of person I would consider a partner is someone who has been in my office every day for 2 years, doing excellent work under difficult conditions without complaint, who refused a significant sum of money to leave, who found a folder she was not supposed to find and came to tell me about it directly rather than using it for her own purposes, and who asked me a question last week that I had not had the courage to answer correctly the first time." He paused. "I said the word he used was incorrect because it implies a standard set by people who do not know what they are measuring, and the people in that room were not qualified to define it, and neither was he." She sat with that for a moment. She sat with the full shape of it, the way she sat with things that were too large to take in all at once, letting it arrive in sections. She thought about the Thursday meeting above her head and Marcus leaving through the stairwell door without looking at her, the exit of a man who had received something he had not prepared to receive. She thought about 6 months of a plan and 40 minutes to dismantle it, and the specific kind of damage that was done by being corrected in front of the people you had been trying to impress. She thought about the family upstairs and what they had heard and what they were going to carry out of that room, about a man who had said in front of witnesses that his brother was wrong, and here was the reason, stated clearly and without qualifier. She looked at Nico. She said, "That was not a small thing to say in that room." "No," he said. "It was not. In front of that family," she said. "Yes," he said. "That was deliberate." She looked at him. He looked at her. The floor was quiet, and the city was outside the windows, and the work was on her desk, and would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the arrangement they had was in the process of becoming something else, and had been for 2 weeks, and was now further along in that process than it had been this morning, and she was going to have to decide what she did with the further along, which was the question she had been carrying since the moment she had let go of the door handle in his office a week ago and walked back to the chair. She said, "I did not take the money." "I know," he said. "You knew," she said. "When did you know?" "Before I asked if you were all right on Thursday," he said. "I had someone confirm it Wednesday evening." She looked at him. "You had someone confirm whether I had accepted a severance offer," she said. "Yes," he said. She thought about this. She thought about a man who communicated in actions and who had, on the Wednesday evening after Marcus called her, had someone confirm whether she was still here. She thought about what it meant that the first name had come the next morning, and the question about whether she was all right had come the afternoon after that. She said, "The order of that is interesting." "Yes," he said. He did not add to it. He did not explain it. He looked at her with the expression she had spent 2 weeks accumulating a name for, and she looked at him across her desk in the office they had shared for 2 years, and she thought, "I have the name for it now." She had the name for it, and it was not something she was going to say out loud tonight in this office with the work on her desk and the city outside the windows and the 2 weeks of becoming something else still recent enough to be tender. But she had the name, and she was going to keep it, and she was going to do what she did with things she knew and did not yet know what to do with, which was carry it carefully and wait for the right moment. And she was going to be patient because she was very good at patience, and because some things needed the patience in order to become what they were going to become. She looked at him. She said, "I have the Henderson file ready if you want to go through it tonight." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had named. Then he said, "Yes, give me 10 minutes." He went to his office. She pulled up the Henderson file. Outside the windows, the city went on doing what it always did, burning and moving and indifferent to two people in an office in the process of becoming something they did not yet have a word for, but that both of them, for the first time in 2 years, were no longer pretending was not there. She arranged the file. She made 2 cups of tea, milk last in both, and she carried them down the hall and knocked on his open door. And he looked up, and she set one on the corner of his desk, and she sat down in the chair and opened the file and said, "Page 3, the Henderson property question." And he said, "Yes," and they worked. And it was the same, and it was not the same, and the not the same was the thing that was going to take time and care and all the deliberateness she had, and she was not afraid of that. She had built everything she had with time and care and deliberateness in a city she had come to alone with a suitcase and a job offer and the specific confidence of someone who had spent years proving something to people who were not paying attention. She knew how to build things. She was going to be very good at this.